This video is made possible by Vincero Watches, luxury handcrafted watches at fair prices. You can check them out at vincerowatches.com/brainfood. Prior to the introduction of the UK speaking clock service in 1936, it's noted that people wanting to know the time who didn't have a clock or watch handy would simply call the operator and ask. This resulted in operators spending much of their time telling people the time instead of, routing calls. Prior to this, the somewhat official role of a person telling people the time often fell to employees of the post office, who would pass it on to their mail coaches, who in turn would pass it on to the public when they made their rounds. With exchange operators being inundated with calls from people just wanting to know the time, it was evident from almost the moment telephones were introduced and made available to the British public in the last years of the 19th century that an automated speaking clock system was really needed. Unfortunately, the technology to record human voices wasn't widely commercially available until around the mid-1920s. Even then, it would take until the mid-1930s for the post office, who controlled the telephone system in the UK at the time, to begin designing a machine that would accurately tell you the time audibly. The speaking clock machine, eventually constructed by the post office, was relatively large and contained state-of-the-art technology, including using several electric motors, glass discs, various valves, and photocells. The system was evidently good enough that the service wasn't upgraded until 1963, nearly 3 decades after it was originally introduced. As such, the post office held a competition for the girl with the golden voice. No men were considered for the role, as telephone-orientated jobs were still seen strictly as a female-gendered profession. The winner of the contest would not only become the voice of the speaking clock, but also be given a prize of about 10 guineas, which is about £700 today, a somewhat paltry sum given the billions, after adjusting for inflation, that the service has earned in the decades since its genesis. The woman chosen for the gig was one Ethel Jane Kane, a telephonist. After being selected, Kane was given a script of things to say. She described the recording process in a 1957 Manchester radio interview. "The way I recorded it was in jerks, as it were. I said, at the third stroke, that does for all the times, and then I counted from 1, 2, 3, 4 for the hours, and we even went as far as 24 in case the 24-hour clock should need to be used. And then I said, and 10 seconds, and 20 seconds, and 30, 40, 50 seconds, and o'clock, and precisely, the famous precisely. So what you hear is, at the third stroke, it will be 1, 21, and 40 seconds. She went on to note that the real work was done by the engineers of the post office, who had to painstakingly fit all her lines together so they maintained a natural-sounding cadence. For those who've never called before, since 1936, the line spoken by the talking clock prior to announcing the time has remained more or less exactly as Ethel described it. The disembodied voice on the other end of the line simply states with little variation, at the third stroke the time will be... insert time here. It's at this point that 3 beeps will play, the third of which will coincide with the exact time mentioned, followed by a brief pause before the message plays again. To call the service, users simply had to call 846, which spelled out the first 3 letters of the word time, leading to the service colloquially being known as Tim in the areas of the country using this number. Other areas used different numbers until 1990, when the number you needed to dial was changed more simply to 123. Incidentally, fun fact here, one of the early considered names for the World Wide Web was also Tim, standing for the information mesh. In any event, to maintain the speaking clock service, people calling were initially charged a single penny, a figure that has steadily risen over the years to 30p today, making the service incredibly profitable. Officially introduced on July the 24th, 1936, the British speaking clock service received approximately 13 million calls during its first year of operation, a figure that becomes doubly impressive when you realise the service was only available in London for the first 6 years it existed. With the massive number of calls coming in at all hours, to make sure people didn't clog up the lines at any given time, the post office issued a briefing after the system was debuted, noting, in view of the possibility of certain members of the public becoming so enamored of the golden voice that they are impelled to listen to it for an indefinite period, an automatic device disconnects the circuit at the end of 90 seconds. While the idea of people becoming enamored with a recording of someone reading the time might seem silly, Brian Cobby, the third golden voice of the speaking clock, claimed that he often received fan mail, particularly from women who liked to call the speaking clock at night when they couldn't sleep, just to listen to his soothing voice. Speaking of copies, since its initial inception, there have been 4 permanent, non-guest voices for the speaking clock. The aforementioned Ethel Jane, who provided the voice between 1936 and 1963, Pat Simmons, who provided it from 1963 to 1984, actor Brian Cobby, who lent his voice to the service from 1984 to 2007, and Sarah Mendez da Costa, who is the current voice of the service. All 4 of these individuals became The Voice after entering a Golden Voice competition similar to the one previously discussed, and were variously rewarded with cash prizes in addition to becoming the new voice of the service. As for the accuracy of the speaking clock, though many maintain that the modern speaking clock is accurate to within 1/5000th of a second, this claim is disputed by the National Physics Laboratory, who say that owing to variable delays in the transmission actually getting to your phone, you can probably expect the starts of the seconds pips to be accurate seconds markers within about 1/10th of a second. This said, the service does take extraordinary amounts of care to ensure that the time they give is as accurate as possible, even attempting to account for the delay for the signal to reach your phone. The service is so accurate, in fact, that a minor scandal was caused in 2013 when it emerged that employees at the Ministry of Defence had spent £40,000 of public money, that's about 130,000 calls, calling the service to synchronise their clocks over the previous 3 years, despite the fact that doing exactly that was explicitly banned by the MOD in 2010. Other than MOD employees calling to synchronize watches, it has been noted that the service fields the most calls on 4 very specific days: the day the clocks go forward and back for daylight saving time, New Year's Eve, with people trying to ensure they celebrate the new year at the exact right moment, and November the 11th, so that they can observe the traditional 2 minutes of silence for Remembrance Day at the exact right time, 11 a.m. Despite the huge technological leaps made in the last few decades that would seem to make such a service obsolete, the speaking clock service still fields an estimated 30 million calls every year, or about 82,000 calls per day. That said, this is markedly less than a little under a decade ago, before the ubiquity of smartphones, when the service was pulling in an average of about 200,000 calls per day. With either numbers at 30p a call, the speaking clock is absolutely raking in money. So speaking of time, just before we get into the bonus facts for today's episode, I do want to take a moment to tell you about Vincero watches. I'm wearing one right now. This is a Vincero chronograph. As well as keeping perfect time, it also has a timer, 3 back dials here. They don't just look great, but they serve that function. More functions than the speaking clock, that's for sure. So I picked out a watch with a blue and silver combination, which I think it looks great, but there are lots of other options on the website. You'll be sure to find something that suits your style and your wrist size. I've got small little wrists, so they have a smaller version for me, which is perfect. And with summer coming up, I'd also recommend you check out their Kairos Mesh series. They've got breathable straps, so there's no sweating into the strap during the summer, which is handy. They're also very flexible in terms of style. They can be dressed up or dressed down very easily. Also, all the watch bands on Vincero watches are interchangeable, so you can easily get a new look with your watch very, very easily. Vincero watches believe that luxury isn't about price or specification, it's about detail and craftsmanship, and Vincero watches, they've got plenty of that. Unlike many other watches on the market, they're not about minimalism and all of that stuff. They're more about a classic good look, which is something these watches definitely have. Also, by selling direct to the consumer, they can get a great watch to you at a much better price than you might expect. So go check out the full range of vincerowatches.com/brainfood and use the code BRAINFOOD for a special discount. Thanks to Vincero Watches for sponsoring, and let's get into those bonus facts. At certain times of year, the profits from calls to the speaking clock are donated to various charitable causes, and the service has infrequently employed the use of guest voices to encourage more calls during these periods. Notable guest voices include the voice of Tinkerbell Mae Whitman in 2008, and a 12-year-old girl called Alicia Rowland in 2003 to promote the children's charity Childline. And now for another bonus fact. In America, people calling the operator to ask for the time grew to be such a problem for the New England Telephone and Telegraph Company that in 1918 they issued an official statement saying that their operators would no longer tell people the time, citing that doing so was interfering with the efficiency of the service. How many calls were they getting? Well, despite the telephone not exactly being something everyone had at this point in history, they were receiving over 100,000 such calls per day in New England alone. And now for another bonus fact. During the Cold War in the UK, the plan in the event of a nuclear attack was to utilize the speaking clock service to trigger the automatic warning sirens, as well as inform any callers of the attack. The reasoning for using this system was that the service was called so often that a failure in the system would be reported immediately without anyone officially needing to monitor it. So it made more sense to use it rather than create a new dedicated system that might fail without anyone noticing for some time. And now for another bonus fact. One slight change to the general script for the UK speaking clock occurred occurred between 1986 and 2008, when the service was sponsored by the watchmaker Accurist, with a new line being added stating, "At the third stroke, the time, sponsored by Accurist, will be," and then insert the time there. Given that during these near 2.5 decades the speaking clock was called a few billion times, this is likely one of the most listened to sponsored messages in the history of advertising. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and do not forget to subscribe. Brand new videos just like this every day of the week. Also, please check out our great sponsor Vincero watches. They are linked to below. And as always, thank you for watching.